Today we're going to be talking about one of Michel Foucault's books, the introduction to his series, The History of Sexuality. Here he upturns the conventional view of the history of sex. Foucault begins by noting that the prevailing discourse around the history of sexuality has been to highlight the trend of repression of sex that has apparently dominated since about the 17th century. Before then, of course, sexuality was less of a private matter. In the Roman bathhouse, sex wasn't hidden, but rather put on display. But Foucault doesn't actually agree with the common wisdom that what has happened in recent times has been the repression of sex, the sequestering of it into the shadows. Instead, he argues that there has been an explosion in discourse surrounding sex that has had the opposite effect of repression, namely turning it into a matter of public interest. The reason why this happens is because, in order to regulate sex or forbid certain kinds of sex, it's first necessary to crystallize it into a language, to analyze it, to dissect, and to understand it. Though this discourse around sex was couched in euphemisms and metaphors, it nonetheless actually ended up bringing to the surface that which one ordinarily would think to be hidden. The beginning of this exposure was accomplished by Christianity through the means of the confession. By the 16th century or so, it became expected that one should spare no detail regarding one's sins and sexual habits. Everything from imprudent thoughts, fantasies, and tendencies to the actual acts of sex should be confessed so that nothing is hidden from the light of God. In order to actually confess one's sex, obviously it's necessary to come up with a way to speak about it. And so we have the beginnings of a genuine sexual discourse within confession. Following confession, sexuality became the interest of political power, and then states took to task codifying and regulating sexual behavior. The definitions and implications of various kinds of sex were explored in juridical fashion and intertwined with a whole apparatus of power. Increasingly, sex also became a subject for fields such as architecture, how the design of institutions and public spaces influenced sexual interaction. Schools were sexually segregated, dormitories were designed in such a way as to minimize privacy, and what we can see generally from this decision-making is a certain implicit consciousness of sex that had never before been seen. So far from being hidden underground, never to be scried, scrutinied, nor mentioned, sex in the age of repression actually ends up becoming one of the most pertinent subjects in discourse and law. Following the juridical and institutional discourse around sex, there would then be the medicalization of sexuality. It wasn't just a matter of civil propriety or moral custom. Now a whole range of etiologies for a variety of illnesses were deduced from different acts and conditions of sex. Abnormal sexuality was not just a moral abomination, but also at the root of various illnesses. Of particular note are the nervous disorders, which are said to have originated from a dysregulated sexual lifestyle. Foucault notes one case where a farmhand who played sexual games with a young village girl was acquitted of his acts under the rationale that he had been suffering from a sex-based psychiatric aberration, after which he was confined to a mental institution. We saw then the rise of the figure of the pervert, who is not just morally sick, but also mentally and physically sick. Alongside the pathologization of different kinds of sex, we see also that homosexuality, for example, is considered an illness. The emergence of this new discourse to Foucault has an interesting effect. Rather than leading to the repression or marginalization of sex and different sexualities, it has actually diversified them. One might trace the modern phenomenon of sexual identity back to this discourse, which ironically originated in a desire to control sexuality. By the act of categorizing sexualities, power had unwittingly created new identities. Before this discourse had emerged, there wasn't a distinct identity for homosexual men. Homosexuality was merely one behavior out of many that some men chose to engage in. For one to declare himself to be a homosexual was very rare. However, after the invention of homosexuality as a disorder, it became a distinct identity. Now a man could, without any dissimulation, be a homosexual. It became less so a matter of forbidding the act of sodomy, as it was a matter of controlling and treating a distinct illness in the form of the person of the homosexual. Foucault then finds a distinction between Eastern and Western cultures. He notes that Eastern cultures had created an ars sexualis, or art of sexuality. They secretly transmitted initiatory doctrines revolving around specific sexual postures and techniques aimed at producing ecstasy. We might think of Hindu Tantra, for example. Rather than problematizing sex, they mined it for its possibilities and celebrated it, holding it in great esteem. It was not a matter of mental categories nor of discourse, but rather a silent transmission from master to disciple. What distinguishes the West, however, is that it has failed to form any ars sexualis. Rather, it created a scientia sexualis and a consequent discourse subject to a will to knowledge. And in this will to knowledge, it found a certain pleasure, or a way to exploit pleasure, if you will. The pleasure of bodies became the pleasure of analysis, a purely intellectual pleasure, as well as consequently the pleasure in the exercise of power. Sex in the West is therefore more highly regimented, and a more keen, critical eye is directed toward it. Sexual questions are held in high esteem rather than the sexuality itself. It's almost, as it were, that the West had invented a surrogate for sexuality. Foucault locates part of this will to knowledge in the act of confession. As I talked about in my previous Let's Read Foucault, he traces the development of Western inquiry through the developments of law and jurisprudence, and it's here that we also find the importance of the confession. The confession first becomes a means of producing truth. In the Christian Middle Ages, it had been used to suss out the truth of sexuality for the sinner. Later, the confession became the primary means by which courts ascertained the truth of the guilty. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the confession becomes a confrontation between a doctor and the patient he was to treat. Every form of sexual activity must be confessed to the doctor so he can render a diagnosis and treatment. The primary source for this will to knowledge is the involvement of power in sex. Power requires knowledge to be effective, and the effect of this growing discourse, as well as the medicalization of sexuality, is to give the task of regulation of sexuality this knowledge. Now, Foucault then moves on to discussing what he calls the deployment of sexuality. This is the alternative to the repression hypothesis. The typical left-wing approach to analyzing the history of sex is to posit that the bourgeoisie began controlling sexuality to ensure the maximum utility in production. Thus, in this way, repression of sex is also the oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie. However, Foucault finds a different pattern unfolding in history. Mainly, he noted that the bourgeoisie, rather than prescribing sexual policy for the masses, actually first practiced these sexual controls on themselves. He noted that the locus of this sexual technology is chiefly on heredity, as medical experts in the 19th century stressed the role of abnormal sexuality in the degenerescence of genetic lineages. The special heredity of the noble classes was blood, but for the bourgeoisie, it was the body. This became a way for the bourgeoisie to form a new kind of class consciousness centered on the deployment of sexuality, or the special utilization of sexuality. So far from repressing sexuality for the masses, or even for themselves, the bourgeoisie saw special value in sexuality itself. Works of the 19th century testified to the fact that the bourgeoisie were concerned with improving their longevity, health, mental well-being, and other such traits. For them, the deployment of sexuality was a tool to ensure their own dominance. The deployment of sexuality for the proletariat would occur only later, as a consequent effect of the invention of population and the mass medicalization of society. Now that the birth rates of populations can be measured, and now that the ruling classes are cognizant of the importance of birth rates for the engine of economic productivity, ensuring that the lower classes procreate becomes of vital importance. And so we see the deployment of sexuality commence for the proletariat. Finally, Foucault ends by noting the effect that psychoanalysis in the 20th century had on sexuality. The shift in paradigm from the old view that excess sexuality called pathology had become inverted, so that now repression was seen as the cause of pathologies. The role of confession in producing the truth about sexuality had transformed too, now taking place between a psychoanalyst and his patient. The concern of law then gradually became more so about relinquishing the repression of sexuality, gradually as laws against adultery and premarital sex were repealed. This then brings us to today, where we have seen the end of laws against sodomy, and finally the end of the pathologization of abnormal sexualities such as homosexuality.